G'day folks, welcome to this playthrough of the Battle of Monmouth, the 28th of June 1778, the climax of Washington's chase of Clinton's British army through New Jersey on their way to New York. This is of course part of the Battles from the Age of Reason series, and I'm using the 3rd edition rules for this playthrough. But before I get into the setup and the battle, I wanted to have a look over the two forces, and we'll start with the American army out here on the left. This force, of course, has just been quartering at Valley Forge, where under this man here, von Steuben, they've been improving their drill and discipline in this European standard. And Steuben should have an American state named after him, really. He has transformed this army into what you see before you now. And a key characteristic of pretty much all of these forces is their 24 morale value here on encounter. Most of these forces here have that value of 24, which will enable them to go toe-to-toe with Clinton's British force in this area. It's respectable, it's manageable, and it should be a very close battle. Now, there are some, of course, local militia out here on the right. So you've got the Middlesex militia, this is the Monmouth militia, and so forth. And they do have fairly high morale values. 36, 36, 36. Then we do have some lighter infantry up the top here. These guys have some pretty good morales of around 21. I think they're also 21. So they're pretty strong as well. A good artillery component spread throughout the wings, brigades. And then again, this is an important element of the Battle of Monmouth, particularly in the afternoon when Washington set up these guns on that ridge, and there was that big artillery duel. Some key personalities, of course, we have George Washington way up the top here. This is, I've been trying to remember, I think this is my first battle from the American Revolutionary War, War of Independence. This is the first time I've played through any battles, and it's the first time I've had a George Washington counter in a game that I've played that I can recall. Yeah, aside from von Steuben, you may also recognise, well, some of you may recognise a few, but this guy in particular stands out. Major General Lee, a man of some infamy who really undermined Washington. When Washington was forming a detachment to go and harass the English on his pursuit through New Jersey, he offered command of this detachment to Lee, and Lee said, "Oh no, it's too small a command for an officer of my standing." So Washington gave it to this guy instead, Lafayette, who led those troops on a very quick march through New Jersey before rejoining. But Lee realised that Lafayette was given a bigger command than he anticipated, and Lee went to Washington and said, "Hey, can I get that command back?" And Washington said, "Okay, go ahead." So Lee eventually retook command of the advanced corps and was responsible for really initiating this battle right on this pretty much where these sheets are. I'll go over the terrain in just a moment. And then we had the British Army, and they have roughly comparable morale rates. 24 throughout most of these forces. Some of the guards do have better, so these guys are great. They're on 18 with a great CV bonus for combat. There are, you can see over here, the rear guard. We do have, of course, these powerful light dragoons, 24 morale. They should be 24 as well. Yep, 24 and 22 for the British foot units. So the British probably have a very slight advantage in morale. I should say they do have these loyalist units as well, and they do have a reduced morale of 34, I think, throughout most of these units up here. And they're, of course, led by Clifton. You may recognise Cornwallis over here, and Kniphausen commanding the 2nd Division. So these guys were... The story is, of course, the British had withdrawn from Philadelphia and were trying to march towards the sea, or towards New York, and Clinton organised for the British ships to pick them up. I think Sandy Hook, way out on the coast of New Jersey. So they were on their way from Philadelphia out to the coast through New Jersey, and they were being harassed along the way by that American army and militia and so forth. They were creating roadblocks and just impeding their passage along the way. Clinton, well, we believe Clinton was keen to give battle, and he chose this site to give battle for its defensive terrain, and he settled here for a while before beginning to move out, I think on June 28th in the morning, early hours of the morning. This is when Lee advanced with this elements of the avant-garde through this area here. They saw this British rearguard around Monmouth Courthouse, and in fact they were just, I think, in the process of withdrawing to the northeast. Lee attacked, the rearguard turned, stood their ground, and almost immediately Clinton, up in the northeast, cancelled the march and ordered both 1st and 2nd Divisions to come back and attack what he believed to be, well, rightly so, just the advanced guard of that American force. Lee, much of that early fighting took place around here, pretty much in front of Monmouth Courthouse, just in front of the wooded area here where many of those Americans emerged from. Lee realised he was facing more than just a rearguard, and he tried to order an ordered retreat. There are mixed accounts on how ordered that was. Lee certainly thought he had succeeded in ordering his men in an ordered fashion. Washington was frustrated that Lee hadn't communicated when he arrived on the battlefield around midday, way up in the northeast on the road to, I think it's called Englishtown, way up in the northwest. So that the main American force didn't arrive until early afternoon, and they marched down here, and Washington set up the bulk of this American army around, way up here in this area here. He set them up on what's known as, I guess, Perrine. This is Perrine Farm, Perrine Ridge along here. This is an amazing map. Hopefully you've been looking at the map and getting a sense of the beautiful colours and textures. This is, of course, designed by Rick Barber and Tim Schleif. It is one of, very quickly, I haven't even started the battle yet, it is, I think, one of my favourite Clash of Arms games maps. The detail of the farms, things like this hedgerow here, everything looks amazing. The roads, these little gullies, there's a swamp. Where is it? Down here. This is important terrain which slowed down the British as they advanced. So take a look at that as I go over this. So the Americans stood their ground here. This is where Washington set up their guns. As the British advanced slowly, Lee's now what was an advanced guard now became a rear guard as they retreated, and they fought some stands along here before pulling back to the main force. And the British advanced to this creek. This bridge became important here as a holding point. And across this ground, across Sutphen Farm, there was an artillery duel in the early afternoon. And around 3 p.m, Clinton, not realising believing he couldn't force Washington's position, then gradually withdrew, and he was gone by the following morning, I think, mainly. So this is where, it's over this ground that the bulk of that fighting took place, sorry about that, on the 28th of June. Early morning, out here on the right, in front of the courthouse, and then as that main British force advanced, they pushed through this area here towards that Perrine Ridge up in the northwest. It is very difficult, because it's a big map, a lot of movement of the focus of fighting with this British avant-garde fighting the British rear guard out on the right, relatively small forces. I think still a couple of thousand men fighting there before these two larger forces became involved. I think it's going to be difficult for this for any simulation to mirror the history exactly. So much can happen over the course of this battle. I've only showed you this really central area, but it's a big map and a lot can happen in terms of flanking maneuvers. Of course, the British almost outflanked the Americans to the north. A lot can happen. So I'm not going to make any predictions. I'm not going to really go into this with any clear strategy. The Americans want to embarrass the British, so they're going to try to inflict as many casualties as possible. The British also want to inflict a devastating blow on the Americans, so they've got the same plan. Other than that, there are no plans to capture certain ground, relieve any sieges or anything like that. It is just about both commanders, Washington and Clinton, want a victory. They want to defeat their opponent. That's what's really driving both of these forces here. They both believe, or they're both hoping at least, that they can secure a victory around Monmouth Courthouse. We'll see how things go. So here we have the starting setup. This is, of course, scenario 3, the grand battle, which begins at 10 a.m. And you can really see here Lee's advanced guard have pushed up into this area around here, into the woods. And this is, of course, the British rear guard. Some light infantry. Where is everyone? Some light infantry here. The light dragoons, I think. So light dragoons out here on the far right. Yep. We have some more dragoons here, out on the far left. And in the centre, the Queen's Rangers with the small force of Queen's Rangers Dragoons. One thing to point out in the Battle of Monmouth is that each strength point represents half of what it normally does in battles from the Age of Reason. So instead of this infantry here representing 200 men, it's actually half of that, so it's actually 100. So each strength loss is just 50 men. This makes this very interesting. There are effectively many company-size units. These are only 100 men, 100 men, 100 men, 100 men, and so forth. It changes stacking and multi-hex formation rules and regulations. For the most part, for this battle, there will be probably no multi-hex formations at all. Just a lot of these small, effectively company-sized units, 100 men moving around the field. Very small force sizes. So, Lee's advance guard is here. They have sound numbers, but I don't think they have... Actually, what do they have? 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 25. The biggest problem is going to be not necessarily this rear guard, but these British reinforcements, which will start to arrive at the 10:20 a.m. turn. So Lee is going to have to pull back along these roads. Historically, I think they pulled out around here, but through this wooded area. And the British are going to try and pin them down and slow them down. As I said, no big plans. We do have some way off in the far left, some of that local New Jersey militia. You can see them way off down here near the what's it called? The Tenant Meeting House. I should know that one. But the bulk of these American reinforcements won't be arriving until 1 p.m. So these guys basically have 3 hours to hold off this mass of British reinforcements. I said no plans, but I think what we're going to try and do is keep them as far to the east as possible, prevent them just marching at speed off to the west. Trying to survive. A lot of these units are so small. 2 hits and they're eliminated. Try to use the woods to their advantage. Try and defend in this wooded terrain. It's going to be very interesting. Stay tuned. Now, one of the other things I should point out is that Lee is effectively army commander on the field for these first 2 hours until Washington arrives at around midday. So he is army commander, he has a very low initiative, and in effect, I think Clinton, commanding these Crown forces, has about a +3 bonus over him. It means that really the British have the activation advantage for the first 2 hours. Now, initially, the British are outnumbered here, and this is where it gets interesting because the Crown forces know, Clinton knows he has his 1st Division coming back onto the road, down this main road towards Monmouth Courthouse. But, I mean, historically, Lee didn't know this, and Lee was driving quite hard until around this point. Lee's forces, this advanced guard, starts off in pretty good defensive terrain. They're in wooded terrain, in the orchards. They've got these guns set up with broad, open, long-range fields of fire. And at this point, Lee is happy to stay. The Americans are happy to stay where they are and primarily defend this ground, hold this ground. In the very least, slow down the British. If they can slow them down at these key areas, it'll be to their benefit and enable those later American reinforcements to come onto the field. Now, you might notice behind the lines here, Maxwell's forces, Maxwell's brigade, is moving sort of to the northeast behind the lines, behind Lee, up along that main road. They're about to move into the woods. At this point, at 10 a.m., they were thinking that they would take up a position on the American left in that open ground and threaten Clinton's rearguard. In the opening move, the British Crown forces slowly advanced. They limbered their artillery and began to move that close to the lines, with the light dragoons out on the left, pretty much just guarding those flanks. The Americans got a very lucky artillery shot on those light dragoons and caused a hit. This is pretty much at extreme long range, the maximum extent of their range, but they were lucky enough to get just one hit on those light dragoons. At the 10:20 a.m. turn, you can see behind the lines Maxwell's brigade beginning to get into line formation, and they've reconsidered as the British pushing straight at the American centre. Maxwell's thinking that he'll just hold the line here as a reserve, and those forces out on the far left, they'll begin to move into the woods to the left, just to threaten that British flank. This is, I think, Grayson's brigade of line troops. So they'll try and get into those trees, not necessarily to advance on the British, just to threaten them if they push too far against the Americans in those orchards in the centre. And again, American artillery got another successful hit out on those 16th Light Dragoons way out on the far left. So that unit with 5 steps has actually been reduced to 3 within 40 minutes of marching around. And as we zoom out, you can see just on the far right, the first of those British reinforcements beginning to arrive and heading down that main road. Now at this point, the Crown forces in road column on that main road can move very quickly. And so Maxwell at this point reconsiders his position. And in the 10:40 a.m. turn, this is the end of the 10:40 a.m. turn here, you can see that he's quickly got his men back into road column, and they're marching back around the road where they'll head towards Monmouth Courthouse. You can see here, this is again just on 11 a.m. where those dragoons are now pushing out to the left of the American line. You can see those British reinforcements driving down the road towards Monmouth Courthouse. On the far left of the American lines, again, you can see Grayson's men just trying to slowly push into those woods just to threaten that Clinton's right flank of his rearguard. Now, at the end of the 11 a.m. turn, you can see behind the lines on the far left that American militia has really struggled to get the activation to move where they need to do. They're slowly making their way to the front. You can see on the far right more of those Crown reinforcements arriving. This turn saw those light dragoons charge the American left. You can see the aftermath of this charge. So 2 squadrons of Queen's Light Dragoons, about, what does this equate to? I think it was 8, so about 200 Light Dragoons charging the infantry out just below Lee in the centre of the image here. Lee's men quickly changed to square, which is very risky. I think it's a plus 40 modifier to the morale. They passed, formed square, cavalry continued their charge, and suffered, I think it was a 2R/1D result. So the defenders were disordered, suffered 1 hit. They just didn't have enough to form square, so they are shaken and disordered. But the attacking dragoons both routed, and they've pulled back behind the lines. One of those recovered. You can see them shaken and disordered out in the far right. One of those units continues to rout as more of those Crown reinforcements push in. You can see in the far north now, Grayson's men have taken up position in the forest, and some more of those British dragoons have just shifted to the right to watch them. These guys are just watching it sort of for the time being. Neither really want to. The dragoons don't want to push into the woods, and Grayson's men don't want to push out where the dragoons can charge. So it's just really eyeing each other off. In the centre, Clinton's skirmishers are trying to have a go at Lee's men in the forest, in the orchard, sorry, but without much success. Now, during the 11:20 turn, Maxwell's men continued along that road and entered Monmouth. And they just beat those British grenadiers into Monmouth. Not much else happening, more British rushing down that road, more Crown forces rushing down that road. A few little hits from the American artillery. They haven't been too lucky with their opportunity fire. They can fire at maximum range against units in road comms, a special Monmouth rule, but they've been pretty unsuccessful with their firing at these units in road comm, with very few hits being scored. The skirmishers in the centre, those British skirmishers, are suffering some issues. Sorry, this is the Queen's Rangers, these green units in the centre. They've suffered pretty heavily. One of those units has suffered 3 out of 4 step losses. It's about 150 men out of 200. So they're in a bit of trouble. But of course, behind the line, a lot of Crown reinforcements arriving. And way up in the north, those men just eyeing each other off once again. Now, during the 11:40 a.m. turn, the Grenadiers down the south and the Hessian Grenadiers, these are those 3 blue and yellow or cream and blue units way down the south, begin to form into line formation and prepare to make their advance into Monmouth. Yeah, that's about all that happened this turn. In the north, an exchange of fire, more Crown reinforcements moving down that road pretty slowly. I mean, they're taking their time. They probably should be rushing, but they're taking it very carefully and starting to file out into line formation. During the 12 o'clock turn, Washington arrives. You can see up in the top left, those militia still very slowly making their way to the lines. The Americans had the first activation of this turn. This is a very interesting turn. The Americans had the first activation, and we gave it to Maxwell, who is putting his men into line in the orchards around Monmouth Courthouse. Again, picking some defensive terrain. Those buildings in Monmouth don't do much at all. They're just for visual effects. They have no kind of defensive benefits. The orchards do, however. So his men have taken up a position in the orchards, and those grenadiers have responded by also forming line and preparing to confront them. However, this was the only American activation for this turn. Every other activation went to the British. So you can see there, there's grenadiers, the Hessians, and above them some of the men of the 1st Division beginning to form into line. and preparing to really drive into this open ground north of Monmouth Courthouse, with again plenty more reinforcements coming along down this road. Now, at the start of this 12 o'clock term, we also begin to implement the heat effect rules. And you can see really among the Crown forces, a lot of these disordered tokens, they're almost all from the results of heat, disorder, movement checks. So as really the Crown forces are advancing against the Americans, they're the ones who are going to be most affected by the heat in the coming hours. So keep an eye on those disorder counters, because this is mainly, as I said, the result of heat exhaustion, which is really going to impede those Crown forces as they advance. And during the 12-20 turn, those Grenadiers continue to push against Maxwell's forces, Maxwell's brigade in the orchards. Just really an exchange of fire at this stage. But thus far, the Americans have had the upper hand. Their cannons firing point blank into these Grenadiers. And the Grenadiers being pretty unsuccessful in their fire combat. They've been rolling, unfortunately, pretty low. Nonetheless, with the Hessian Grenadiers coming up on the left now, I think Maxwell's going to be in trouble. But you can see behind the lines there that the militia moving very slowly. I mean, they could move a lot faster. They can move very quickly on these roads, but they're just kind of keeping an eye on the situation. They're just kind of hanging out in reserve, waiting to see what the British do. In the centre, this is where the British are now revealing, I think, their main drive. You can see a couple of these forces filing out into line and moving into this open ground. And I think the Americans are going to have to respond to this pretty quickly. Things are pretty quiet out on the right. There's an exchange of fire, and that's about it out on the right. Well, the 12:40 turn saw the British Crown forces finally getting involved in detail. Around Monmouth, the 1st Grenadiers, devastating fire against the Americans in 2 separate volleys. One in the centre with the Grenadiers eliminated an entire American battalion. This was the, I think, 2nd New Jersey Regiment. And then the Hessian Grenadiers, just further to the south. This is the, these guys, the Mini Grenadier. They, again, launched a pretty powerful salvo and eliminated the 4th New Jersey Regiment. Just in fire combat, really big rolls, large number of SPs firing to those defensive hexes, and in both cases, both fire combats eliminated entire battalions. Following up from that success, the Grenadiers launched an assault against another, the 3rd New Jersey Battalion. They only caused 1 loss, but they did rout that battalion, and now you can see them behind the line to the northwest of Monmouth. In the centre, the British, buoyed by the success, sent in the Guards Battalion right into the centre. So we had the strongest of the Crown forces driving straight at George Washington and that New Jersey militia. The militia have formed in line. They were preparing to support those line forces in Monmouth. They're now about to be attacked by those very strong Guards battalions. In the northwest, the American reinforcements are arriving this turn, and they're rushing as fast as they can down this major road. But it's looking bad for the Americans in the south around Monmouth. Behind the lines, in the centre, you've got more Crown forces. This is Cornwallis's men of the 4th Brigade moving up in the centre. The 5th Brigade on their right. They're the sort of troops with the blue text. And out on the right, Clinton's little detachment there, the light troops and the skirmishers. They're just holding their ground, but they firing into those defenders in the orchards, and a lucky shot managed to kill Lafayette. Lee was very lucky to survive. This is a leader loss result. Lee and Lafayette stuck together, Lee survived, but Lafayette was killed in that fire combat. And that's about it for the 12:40 turn. So heading into the 1 o'clock turn, we had a morale check, an army morale check. And it's actually the British who have suffered most losses. The Americans at this point have suffered 12 SP losses, most of them from Maxwell's brigades, but elsewhere only the 1 or 2 hits among their other forces of the advanced corps. The British, however, have suffered their light dragoons. That light dragoon unit that routed continued to rout. They could just never recover, and they kept losing SPs, and they've been eliminated. The 3rd squadron of those 16 light dragoons have suffered 3 casualties. The Queen's Rangers, as I mentioned earlier, those skirmishers have suffered 3, and the Grenadiers, despite getting that late success, suffered about 7 casualties in total. This is also, the Guards have lost 1, von Kospoth's Grenadiers have lost 1, and so there's a few other little hits here and there from those other foot units and Grenadiers, which brings the British to 20 losses and their first roll on the Army Loss chart, which I'm just about to do. The result is a 4, so they escape unscathed with a 0 result. So they're still at +0. That's at the start of this 1 p.m. turn. Now the 1 o'clock turn was pretty devastating for the Americans. Out on the left, those Grenadiers pretty much wiped away the rest of that New Jersey brigade. Maxwell and the 3rd New Jersey survived well behind the line. They did rout and then they recovered at the end of the turn. But again, we saw the elimination of another New Jersey battalion. So the 1st, 2nd and 4th have all been wiped away with their field artillery as well. It's really just the 3rd New Jersey surviving behind the lines. More important, well, as importantly, just to the right of those Grenadiers, the British Guards, you can see them under these 2 disorder counters in the centre. They charged those militia units. Actually, the militia had the early activation, and I quickly put them into line to attempt to prepare for this, but the Guards just blew them away. What is there, about I think 1,000 Guards across these two units, and the militia stood no chance. So if they get +1 CV, the Guards get, I think, +5 CV in combat, and there is so much more of them, so there's this odds ratio well in the Guards' favour. So the militia routed. You can see some of them still behind the line. A few of them were eliminated because they're such small units, 50 or 100 men. And the British have really broken through on the left here in this open terrain. In the north, Lee's advanced guard have really held their ground. They haven't moved much. They're in the woods. They've been facing east, as you can see, and they're still in this formation. But now they are at great risk of being not only outflanked, but completely surrounded on the east, south, and western side. So they're going to have to pull back very quickly from these positions. Washington now needs to think about where he's going to form his next line. Those reinforcements are near William Wyckoff Farm. They're near the hedgerow and Parsonage Farm. There is this wooded area north of Kerr House that they could stand in, or they could pull back to the bridge and that middle stream near Sutphen Farm in the northwest. Some difficult decisions now for the Americans. What to do is Lee out in the far right. They have been holding up this Crown Light Infantry, the Queen's Rangers and so forth, but they are about to be hit by the 4th and 5th Brigades of Cornwallis's 1st Division. So, interesting developments taking place. So, during the 1:20 p.m. turn, the Americans really begin to pull back. They limber up all their artillery out on the front there, and you can see them beginning to pull back towards those roads. And over the coming turns, you'll see them shift out to the left, where Washington's thinking about where to reform their line with these reinforcements coming on. from the Crown perspective, you've still got the Grenadiers out on the left, gradually pushing forwards. The Guards driving more of those New Jersey regiments back in the centre on the left. And out on the right, you've got Leslie's 5th Brigade and Gray's 3rd Brigade beginning to push against that the American left flank in the northeast. The skirmishers out the far right have just been holding their ground, and now they're pushing into this centre area where they'll threaten that far left flank of the Americans. Now, during the 1:40 p.m. turn, the British 4th Brigade in the centre there, kind of got the yellow text, almost directly north of Monmouth Courthouse. They drive through that centre and they rout the remnants of Lee's brigade. That'll enable the British then to swing through this wooded area towards the west, towards Kerr House. The Guards out on the far left have reformed and are in good order, and the Grenadiers in the centre also forming line in good order. Out on the right, the 5th Brigade is also pushing through to the northwest, whilst the 5th behind them holds their ground. There's a few things happening around this time, so the heat is really wreaking havoc with all these forces. You can see all these disordered markers. There's a lot of dice rolling for this movement under the heat rules, which is slowing everything down. You can see on the main road in the centre of the map that American artillery pulling off to the west, trying to find a new place to unlimber and form a defensive line. The problem is, although the command ratings of Washington and Clinton are equal, they're both +3, the British are tending at this stage to get the bulk of the activations, and the Americans are often finding themselves without activations. You'll notice this over the coming turns, how some of their commands just aren't moving. It's because they're not getting activations. In fact, over the coming turns, there's one turn where the Americans don't get a single activation, and there's another turn where they only get one activation for the entire turn. Just very unlucky initiative rolls. And it means that a lot of these units out on the left are kind of stuck on the roads. Now, of course, they can use road movement at the end of the turn, but they can't do very much else. It's a limited activation, in effect. They are very limited in what they can do. Now, during the 2 p.m. turn, the Americans find their defensive positions almost directly north of Kerr House in this wooded area. So they begin to unlimber their artillery. For the time being, they've set their infantry out in front. It's really by necessity. They're just trying to squeeze in, using their activations when they can. Because they're so limited for activations, they're really rushing to form these defensive positions. The Guards are moving up. You can see the British Guards in the centre to the east of Kerr House. And again, out further to the east, you can see that British 4th Brigade pushing towards that middle stream to clear that out and drive the Americans back. Out in the far right, the Americans are also pulling back towards the woods, and they now have, I think it's the 3rd Brigade in pursuit. And still, there's a traffic jam out to the west. Again, a lot of disorder, a lot of confusion, a lot of these small units not knowing where to go, trying to make space along this one major road towards this wooded area. So Washington's having a bit of trouble sorting out his forces out here. And by the end of the 2:20 p.m. turn, he's got this line of artillery pretty much on the edge of that wooded area along that road, that east-west road. And again, you can see the infantry forming in line in front of that artillery for the time being, and trying to get away from those grenadiers as they advance. There are a few remnants of that, mainly the advanced guard, some more New Jersey casualties. Those poor New Jersey regiments have been almost entirely wiped out by this stage. There might be one or two left somewhere behind the lines. But the Grenadiers and the Guards in pretty good shape at this stage, with You can see in the centre with the yellow text, again, support on their right from the 4th Brigade. And at the end of the hour, at the end of the 2:40 p.m. turn, just on 3 p.m, you see the Guards and the Grenadiers linking up to support each other and preparing to move against these hastily constructed American defences. Again on the edge of the woods, hoping that the wooded terrain will give them some defensive benefit, hoping their artillery will be able to hold off these ground forces as they advance. Again, you can see on the right there, 4th Brigade pushing through the woods. There was out further to the right an attempt by the 5th Brigade, I called them the 3rd earlier, the 5th Brigade to charge against some of that advanced guard out in the American sort of left flank, and they failed and routed. You can see them behind the lines there. But both of these are the 5th Brigade and the British rearguard is now out in the far right, and they're now beginning to harass what was the American advanced guard under Lee. And still out on the west, you can see this traffic jam, this mix of really mainly small infantry forces trying to navigate their way around the roads, trying to deal with disorder, and artillery with their slower movement speed through this wooded terrain, trying to get into a formation out here on the far left. Having said that, it looks like the British are setting up to strike right in the centre of these lines, just northeast of Kerr House. Now, at the start of the 3 o'clock turn, there were some more morale checks taking place. The Americans have now suffered 40 casualties at the start of this hour. A lot of that coming from the last hour of fighting. That poor New Jersey brigade under Maxwell has been just obliterated. They only have their light horse remaining. They've suffered huge casualties. All 4 of their regiments wiped out. Their field artillery wiped out. Jackson's brigade has suffered heavily as well. They've lost 3 of their line regiments. Only their artillery survives. And Dickinson's brigade as well has suffered heavily. This is a militia which just got caught in front of those British guards. As a result, they had another army morale check, and they rolled another 0. So all 3 of their results have been 0. So they're currently, after 3 checks, on +0 morale. The British at this stage are on about 28, 29 losses, but they've been pretty mixed throughout their brigades. So there's nothing really noticeably weak among the British. They had contracted an army loss roll earlier, and they also rolled a 0. So there are currently no army modifiers for either force. And so the British used this 3 p.m. turn to begin to push against those American lines, very carefully, very slowly, waiting for that the Crown 4th Brigade to take up position on their right. But you can see the Hessian Grenadiers in the centre, supported by the Guards on their left. And we've also got, you can see behind the lines there, the 3rd Brigade moving out to take up a position perhaps behind and slightly to the left of the Guards, just to see what happens. There's also got the behind those Hessians, there's the British Grenadiers as well, supporting that attack. Having said that, they are taking this very slow. Just zooming in on the attack so you can see what's happening with the Grenadiers very slowly moving their field artillery up, prolonging them forward. The American guns, for a start, they're not in a great firing position with all this infantry in front of them. The Americans are about to rectify that. But yeah, they haven't done much damage at this stage. And again, just to zoom in here to show the 4th Brigade on the right, Grenadiers in the centre, and the Guards out on the left. And the position of those American defences in that primarily wooded terrain. So with these American defensive positions set, the battle really bogs down from this point on. Take a good look at where these American gun pieces are set up. This line in the woods, this is the line they choose to defend, and they defend it very well. At the 3:20 and 3:40 p.m. turn, The Grenadiers do move up against that American line, and they are trying to harass the Americans and inflict some casualties through fire combat, but they're not having much success in doing so. Out in the far right of that crown line, kind of the centre of this image here, the 4th Brigade just links up with those Grenadiers and is pushing in along the stream on the right, and this is where they do have some small success. So at around the 4 o'clock turn, the Grenadiers in the centre managed to push back some of that American infantry, but the Grenadiers are getting hit pretty hard by those American guns in the wooded area. It's on the 4:20 turn that 4th Brigade does push back that one. This is pretty much their only gain for this whole 3-hour period. So the 4th Brigade joining in, the Grenadiers to their left, the Guards to their left, and then I think it's the 3rd Brigade, over to the far left. They're not pushing, they're just holding the left-hand flank of these British positions. And by the end of the 4:40 p.m. turn, this is pretty much the final position. The Crown forces just won't push out on the left any further. The Grenadiers can't make any ground in the centre. The Guards don't really push any further beyond here. They're kind of holding this centre area. They're hoping that the Grenadiers to their right and the 4th Brigade will make progress, but they just failed to do so. And over the next hour, as we go through these images, this is a view from behind the American lines. This line just holds, and more American reinforcements arriving. There is, again, the typical traffic jam along that main road. They just order and they slow everything down, but they're not needed anyway because this line of American guns is holding in that wooded terrain. So really heading into the final hour of this battle, around the 5 o'clock turn, into the 5:20 turn, the lines don't change much. You can see these British lines, Crown lines, staying exactly the same as they were an hour, nearly 2 hours ago. The Grenadiers by this stage have lost one of their Hessian regiments in the centre. The others are looking quite weak. The 4th Brigade out on the right, still doing okay, but just making no progress against these Americans in the wooded terrain. And out on the left there, you've got several waves of Americans now heading towards that left flank where the 3rd Brigade are. It's around about the 5:40 turn when the British decide to pull back, realising they can't make any more headway against these American positions. And really this is just an exercise to make sure they can pull back safely. The Americans give a brief pursuit on the left, in the American right and the American centre, but because it's difficult for them to activate and there are so few activations in a turn, there's also the risk that the British could very easily counterattack and do some damage. And the Americans have suffered the bulk of the casualties thus far. So at the end of the 5:40 p.m. turn, the Americans have suffered 65 losses. Now, some field artillery count as half a loss, so I've counted that into 65, so it's basically 65 including those half losses from field artillery. In contrast, the British have suffered 43 losses. So, the Americans have suffered 50% more losses during this period. And as I said, because the British losses have been really scattered throughout their units, they're all relatively strong. The Guards are still strong. That 3rd Brigade on the left is still strong. The 4th Brigade out on the right is still strong. They just don't have enough strength to break through these stubborn American defenders in the woods. The Americans, on the other hand, have a lot of these very weak infantry regiments, almost at company size, and they're trying to advance with these. And as I said, in doing so, they're just very vulnerable. The British can so easily counter or just hold their ground and fire back. If you look at the southern side of this image here, where those two 3rd Brigade
regiments are of the British Crown Forces, they can fire an adjacent hex with effectively 12 SPs of infantry. They are, I think, line, which gives them basically 48 strength points firing against 10. So it gives them 4-to-1 odds, which can be devastating against these Americans. So it's at this point that the Americans, they did pursue for a little bit just to see what could happen. Washington, of course, wanting to embarrass the British forces, but at this point, at 6 p.m, they halt the chase, they halt the pursuit, and they enable the British to withdraw from the field. Now, there is a formula you can use to technically determine victory or defeat in this scenario. It involves checking to see where the British advanced to and basically cross-referencing the hexes that they've occupied and then multiplying this by the loss value differential. I think if we did that, it would technically be an American victory. But I think it's best to consider this a draw. Neither side really achieved their objective. The British certainly inflicted some heavy losses on the Americans, but ultimately the Americans were able to hold their ground and stand up against this quite strong British army. So both sides can really claim something from this battle, as they did historically. The British embarrassed Lee in the advanced guard and inflicted an early morning defeat on the Americans historically. That somewhat happened here in this battle. Ultimately, the American reinforcements arrived, and with their full force, they were able to hold those Crown forces and I think prove themselves as somewhat equal, or at least able to stand the field against the British. So, I mean, for what I've played here, I'm happy to call this a draw, to say that both sides took something from this.
So, yes, I'm ending the battle early. It is 6 p.m. The battle could go on for a further 5 hours with dusk and night turns, but my point is there is very little, I think, that can really happen during this period with so few activations available. Each side is getting, on average, 2 activations a turn. And the British have, let me put it this way, the British have stronger activations. So, for example, if they activate the 3rd Brigade, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 regiments being activated with around 5 times 7, around 35 SPs active in that activation. Conversely, when the Americans activate in pursuit, they're only activating 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 SPs. So a third of what the British are activating. And generally, on average, the activations are equal, so it's 1-to-1. You're getting, as I said, about 2 to 3 activations per turn. This is not enough activations for anything substantial to happen during these evening and night turns. That's why I'm calling it here. So just taking a moment to reflect on, again, strategy. The British should have pushed harder earlier. I know that, and I knew that at the time. You just got the sense at around 11, 12 that the British were just not pushing fast enough. Even coming down this road towards Monmouth, I was taking my time, and at the end of each turn I was like, I should have moved faster with those British, should have moved them further, should have hit the Americans out on the right. There's still this stalemate, standoff happening out here on the right, where there just aren't enough activations in a turn. I keep talking about not enough activations in a turn. Let me show you the turn record track to illustrate what I'm talking about. So we're here, and the end turn number is a 9. So whenever anything more than a 9 is rolled, which is most of the time, barely,
this slides up one. And then there are only effectively 2 activations before the end turn, and these are limited activations where not much can really happen. So yeah, the British needed to push harder. I think the American strategy was pretty good. Yes, they suffered heavily, but they slowed the British down. That New Jersey brigade and the militia certainly made a stand and slowed the British down around Monmouth at the cost of some very heavy casualties. Was it worth it? I don't know. Well, they certainly slowed the English down and enabled these reinforcements to come along. The Americans managed to get their artillery here just in time. It really was amazing how timely the placement of those reinforcements was. And then that line stood. As I said, the British only really captured one of these hexes out here on the right. Everything else stood. The guns, with pretty strong infantry behind them. These are mainly 7 strength, 7 SP infantry stacked with the guns, to the point that the British didn't even bother pushing out here on the left. They focused all their attention along this area here and still couldn't break through. Their plan was to try and roll them up from the right. And as I said, it just didn't work. Some Americans holding the bridge here. 4th Brigade helping the Grenadiers out on the right. And still this long line of disordered American reinforcements coming down the road. So that is the Battle of Monmouth, part of the Battles from the Age of Reason series, Clash of Arms games.